Hey, College Math, welcome back. Here is, sorry, 1.5.1. We're looking at graphs in section 1.5. And for the first part of 1.5, we're going to focus on graphs for categorical variables, okay? So our objectives are to create frequency and relative frequency distributions for a data set, and then draw and correctly label bar graphs and or pie charts, okay? We're going to mainly be focusing on bar graphs, and we'll kind of talk about that here in a little bit. Okay, but to start off our section 1.5, different graphs are used for different reasons. The main reason in our purposes of this chapter, the idea is that we use graphs as one way to summarize data. Okay, there's other ways that you can summarize data and kind of interpret it as we've seen in the past few sections. But another way to kind of make claims is by using graphs and kind of using organizing your data and putting it into a graph. Depends on the type of variable, right? And so for our qualitative / categorical variables, we're going to be using either bar graphs or pie charts, right? And so these are the two specific graphs that we use for that type of variable. So then that being said, when you think of like a histogram or a line graph, you would not use either of those graphs for this type of variable, right? So it's kind of important here. This is kind of an important statement. Sorry, my tablet, it was not on. There we go. This is kind of an important statement right here, right? When we have a qualitative variable, so things like, opinions on this, or, race, gender, favorite animal, favorite song, that kind of idea, we're using this type of graph, okay? Before we graph, though, we're going to need to talk about, what is frequency, what's a frequency distribution, that kind of stuff. When I say frequency, we're talking about the number of times a data value occurs in a set, right? And so that kind of means in this case, if I'm asking people for their favorite ice cream flavor, frequency has to do with, for example, if one of my options is vanilla, the frequency of vanilla tells me how many people like vanilla, right? And so that's kind of what frequency is. Frequency distribution is a listing of each data value or grouping of data values called a class. And this right here, this statement is kind of more for numerical variables, but we're going to put it here now just to kind of define frequency distribution. So this is more for numerical or quantitative. We're mainly looking at listing of each data value with their frequencies. Okay, so it's kind of like making a table. Relative frequency, sorry, I meant to highlight this one. Relative frequency, okay, it's the frequency divided by n. And n is the variable we use to refer to the total amount of data points. Okay, and I can also use n to refer to the sample size. Okay, how big is my sample? How many data points am I looking at here, right? So I'm taking every single frequency value and I'm dividing it by n to get a decimal value, a proportion, okay? And you're always gonna get something between 0 and 1, because then what you're able to do is convert that to a percentage if you wanted, okay? Relative frequency distribution, same as frequency distribution, but with relative frequencies, right? Oops, thought I was just using my highlighter. There you go. Okay, and so pretty self-explanatory ideas, but we need these in order to make a bar graph. Okay, so let's go ahead and use those ideas. Okay, so we have an example here. Mr. G asked his Algebra 2 class what their favorite music genre was. We have 4 of his students said hip hop, 12 said R&B, 6 said pop, 2 said country, 5 said rock, and then 5 said other. So the first thing we're going to want to do is to create a table that displays the frequency and relative frequency distribution of the data provided. Okay, so here it's all about just making a table. Okay, so since we're doing frequency and relative frequency, we're going to want a table that has 3 columns, right? Our first column is going to be the music genre. Okay, just kind of listing out the different genres, and I'll do that now. If I can. There we go. Now I'll do it in a different color. We have hip hop, R&B, pop, country, rock, and other. Okay, so I have 6 different data values. Okay, and then I want to list in the next column here my frequency. Okay, so the frequency for each of those data values, okay? So how many times does hip hop happen? 4 times, okay? R&B happens 12, pop 6, 2 for country, 5 for rock, and then 5 for other, okay? So frequency is not terrible. The hardest that it ever gets is instead of telling you that it's 4 for hip hop, 12 for R&B, maybe like I list out the results. Like maybe I give you like a huge table with all the different results. Like I said, you know, hip hop, R&B, R&B. Like if I'm just writing them down as my students are telling me, right? That's another way that it might be listed. And then you just have to count up how many times does R&B happen? How many times does hip hop happen? That kind of idea. Okay, so you might get something like that. But then again, that is not really that difficult in itself because you just got to count, right? Before we do relative frequency, it might be worth to total this up because we're going to need n to find relative frequency. So if I add these numbers up, we're actually going to get an n or a sample size of 34. Okay, so then for our relative frequency, okay, for our relative frequency, we're going to go through and take each of these frequency values and divide it by 34, and that's going to be the corresponding relative frequency value. So for hip hop, I'm going to do 4 divided by 34. Okay, and I'm just going to leave them as fractions for right now as I finish all of them, but I never want to express, like I don't want my answer to be these. I want to write them in decimal form. Okay, 5 over 34 and then 5 over 34. Okay, and we'll just use 3 decimal places for now for each of these. I kind of already went through and divided them, but make sure that you can do it yourself. If I divide these through, this one gives me 0.118. The next one for R&B, I get 0.353. Pop, I get 176. We have 0.059 for country. And then 0.147 for rock and other. Okay, what do these decimals represent? Well, think about relative frequency. Okay, I'm taking the amount of times that that specific data value happens and dividing it by the total amount of different data points. So what's happening here is you're actually finding the percent of hip hop out of the total amount of responses, right? So I can actually convert these to percentages. We don't have to do this, but just to kind of show you, you know, this is what these values mean, right? So I can take it a step further. And when you write the relative frequency part, you can leave it as decimal or you can convert to percentage, right? I'll accept either one. So that means that 11.8% of students in this class like hip hop, right? And then so on and so forth, 35.3% like R&B, 17.6% like pop, 5.9% like country, and then 14.7%, oops, 14.7% for both rock and other, okay? And this is gonna kind of really be important for when we do our pie chart here in a little bit. So maybe because you will eventually do a pie chart, it might be worth your while, even though I said it was kind of optional, it might be worth your while to actually go all the way to percentage as well, okay? So here is our frequency and relative frequency distribution. Okay, it really is just listing out all of these values next to the associated data value, right? So next to the associated genre in this case. Nothing too crazy there. Now we're going to go ahead and make bar graph and pie chart for this data, okay? So we're going to create a bar graph. There's a couple things we need to make sure we're including in our bar graph, okay? And I'll kind of write them out here. We're going to make sure we have a title. We need to make sure we have a scaling on our vertical axis. We need to make sure we have axis labels, so labeling both the vertical and horizontal axis. And then we're going to make sure that the bars in our bar graph don't touch, okay? If they touch, that means we're looking at a histogram, but then it wouldn't make sense for histogram because our horizontal axis is labeled with categories and histograms is labeled with numbers because a histogram goes with numerical data. Here we have categorical data. So we want to make sure our bars aren't touching. And that kind of helps the person who's reading your graph know, okay, these are all different categories, not combined together, okay? You can make a bar graph horizontal or vertical. And so what I mean is that, it can either look like this or it can look like this, right? And so just for our sake, I'm gonna make the graph like normal, like we usually see in, like we're kind of used to seeing, right? We usually see the bars going vertically, right? So I'm gonna make a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. I'm gonna make that line a little straighter. There we go. Okay. And so then before I even put any bars on my graph, I'm going to put a title first. And I'm doing that because I want you to do that as well, because in the past, students always forget the title, okay? And it's always important to have a title for any kind of graph, okay? And so make sure that your title is descriptive for what we're looking at, right? So a title for this one could be favorite music genre. Okay, I want to be a little more specific than that in Mr. G's Algebra 2 class. Okay, so just be as descriptive as possible, but also keep it kind of short and sweet. Enough information so that we know what we're looking at, but then don't make it a paragraph in the title box, right? Okay, so we have our title. And then we're going to want to scale our vertical axis. Okay, so always look at your values. What's your smallest one? I have 2. My biggest one is 12. Okay, so I want to make sure that, first of all, our bar graph is always starting at 0. And then I make sure I have enough so that I capture the highest value, so 12. So it's looking like I can scale this by 2s. Let's see if that'll work. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And you always want to go above a little bit above your highest value. So up to 14 is perfect. Okay. And then I want to label my horizontal axis. You're going to have 2 different labels on the horizontal axis. You're going to label each of the bars that are going to show up. And then you want to give an overall label for what each of those categories are. Okay. So I'm going to start by writing the genres because that's what I have down here, hip hop. And then I have R&B, making sure you're leaving enough room for all of these, right? Pop, country. I'll probably have to extend my horizontal axis a little bit. Rock, and then other. And I am going to extend this a little bit nicely. There we go. Okay, so those are those are going to be the labels for the bars, but then I have to make sure I have an overall label for the horizontal axis. Okay, and here I can just call these music genre, okay, because that's what I have representing on this horizontal axis. And then I also want to label for my vertical axis. This is going to be number of students, right? Because those are the people that I asked. All right, and so now we just draw the bars. Now it's pretty self-explanatory, right? It's nothing too difficult, okay? So hip hop, that had 4, so I'm gonna go all the way up to here. You're gonna wanna try your best to make these bars the same width. So for example, if that's how wide my hip hop bar is, I don't wanna make my R&B bar a lot wider or narrower, right? I wanna try to match that same width. R&B has 12, so I'm gonna go up to here. Okay. Oops. Okay. As you can tell, I'm really bad at drawing straight lines, but that's okay. So pop goes up 6. Country is 2. Rock is up to 5, so right about here. And then same with other. Okay, so I got my title, I got my scaling on my vertical axis, I got my axis labels, and then my bars aren't touching. Okay, we can, if you wanted to, you can fill these bars in. You don't have to, you can just leave them kind of not shaded in. You can color these bars different just to kind of be, maybe help the reader out a little bit to show that there are different bars, whatever you want. These are kind of the minimum requirements, right? Anything else, as long as you're not going extra, anything else just kind of helps, okay? So there's a bar graph, and I'm hoping that you're taking note of all the things that are there, because that's what I'm going to want to see when you do this on a checkpoint, right? I want to see that you can put the title, the axis labels, the scaling, and the different categories, and then make sure your bars are not touching, since we're not looking at a histogram, okay? Awesome. And then let's go ahead and end by making a pie chart, okay? We don't really see pie charts too often, and we actually just prefer bar graphs in general, because a pie chart, we use that to represent parts of a whole, and not every single scenario is representing parts of a whole. Like this scenario does, because, you know, these many people like hip hop, these many people like R&B, et cetera, et cetera. But then this is assuming that one person did not choose multiple genres, right? We're going to assume that that did not happen, but that's not always something that we can assume. Okay, and if we can't assume that, then we're not going to be able to make a good pie chart, because then we'll have one person liking two different things, and that won't be part of a whole, because not every person is going to give one response. Okay, and so that's why we typically try to stick with bar graphs. But let's just kind of go over pie charts, that way you know how to read them. And we'll make sure you can do that by creating one, right? So looking back at our relative frequency, so look back at your relative frequency on your notes. We're going to use those to create the pie chart. So I'll do my best to make a circle. Don't make fun of me if it looks ugly on the first try. Okay, I should have went through and made one earlier, but oh well. Okay, and you know what? That's as perfect as it's gonna get. We're not even gonna try to make it nicer, okay? So there's our circle, and we're gonna wanna make sure that we do kind of the same thing as above. We wanna make sure it has a title. We can keep the same title. So favorite music, music genre in Mr. G's Algebra 2 class. Okay, and then here's kind of the part where, since we're hand drawing this, we don't really need to be super accurate. Try your best. This is mainly why we have computers make it for us, because then the computers can make it exact, right? Because I'm going to want to draw out these percentages, right? So I want to make sure I represent 35.3% somewhat accurately, right? But like I just said, try your best. The easiest way that I like to do it when I'm doing it by hand is pick the biggest one first, which in this case is the R&B slice. Okay, that's going to be 35%. That's going to be about a third of this circle. So that means it's going to be looking like something, I don't know, kind of like this, right? Here's our R&B slice. Okay, and I'm going to label as I go. Okay, so R&B. And you always want to put the category, so the data value, in this case, R&B, and then attach the percentage with it, okay? You always want to make sure those two things go with that slice. And you can do it like I'm doing here, where I put it inside the slice, or if the slice is going to be too small, like we're going to have here in a little bit, I can put it outside, okay? So the next biggest one is my pop, which is 17.6%. That one's a little bit harder, okay? From here to about here would be like 25%. So we're just gonna venture off and say, or another way to think about it is when I combine those two, I get about 50%. So, and I actually get a little more than 50%. So I'm gonna do it like right like this, okay? Again, we're not looking for perfection here since we're hand drawing. So pop, 17.6%. Okay, my next biggest are my two 14.7 categories, my rock and my other. Okay, both of those combined are a little bit less than 30, so it's gonna be a little bit less than a third. So I'm gonna say that it's about that much, okay? And then there's two categories here, so I'm gonna separate it. Okay, and so then one of these is rock. Rock at 14.7%, and then other, oops, I want a different color. Other, also at 14.7%. okay? And then I'm left with my hip hop and my country. Okay, hip hop is about, oops, sorry, lost it, 11%. And then my country's at 5%. We're just gonna go there. Assume that that's good. And so here's our hip hop at 11.8%. And then here I cannot fit this in that slice, so I'm just gonna cheat and do this, right? And so country at 5.9%. Okay, and so there's our pie chart. This is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is just having the percentages inside the slice and then making a key, a color-coded key. I could even just have nothing inside of the pie slices, and then in the color-coded key have the label and the percentage attached to it. That's not the best. We at least usually want the percent near the slice to kind of give you a good idea. And then whenever you have the sample size, you always want to make sure it's displayed. That way people can know, okay, 35.3%, I can figure out exactly how much that is by taking a percent of the n, right? And you remember how to do that, convert that to decimal and multiply that into your n, and you'll get the amount of people in that category or the amount of data points in that category. All right. So there's your pie chart. I'm not going to really often make you draw a pie chart. I think I'd rather you just make sure you know how to read a pie chart, right? And again, it's mainly always just going to be, do you know how to take percentages of the number, right? Okay, so there is our qualitative data graphs, okay? Making sure you can make a bar graph and read one, and then making sure you can read a pie chart is kind of the goal, all right? And then also making these frequency, relative frequency tables. Okay, hopefully that sounded good, and hopefully that wasn't too bad. I will see you in the next one, all right? Have a good rest of your day.